Nobody on Flight 624 noticed the young woman in seat 19F until she saved all their lives. Sophia Rossi appeared to be just another passenger on the manifest, reading a book and sipping coffee as the Airbus A350 cruised at 35,000 feet over the Atlantic. The morning sun painted the cabin of Air France Flight 624 in warm golden hues as it began its descent toward Paris Charles de Gaulle. It was supposed to be a routine transatlantic crossing, the kind of flight that happened hundreds of times daily, carrying business travelers, tourists, and families across the ocean without incident. The Airbus A350 had departed John F. Kennedy International Airport right on schedule, its 298 passengers settling into the familiar rhythm of long-haul travel. In the cockpit, Captain Michel Dubois and First Officer Claire Martin were conducting their standard pre-descent procedures. Dubois, a 24-year veteran with Air France, had flown this route more than 1,000 times. The weather was perfect, clear skies, minimal turbulence, with Paris reporting sunny conditions and light winds. It was the kind of day that made flying feel routine, almost mundane. The passenger manifest showed the usual mix of international travelers. Business executives in first class worked on their laptops, preparing for Monday morning meetings. Families in economy wrestled with restless children who had grown tired of the 8-hour journey. Students backpacked their way across continents, sleeping against windows or watching downloaded movies on their phones. Nobody paid particular attention to passenger 127, listed simply as S. Rossi, seated in 19F. The young woman appeared to be in her mid-20s with the kind of understated presence that made her blend seamlessly into any crowd. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore civilian clothes, jeans, a plain sweater, and comfortable sneakers. Nothing about her suggested military service or aviation experience. Throughout the flight, Sophia had been the perfect passenger. She had politely declined the meal service, read quietly from a worn paperback novel, and caused no disturbance to her fellow travelers. The flight attendants had barely noticed her except to offer the standard service, which she had accepted with a quiet thank you spoken in lightly accented English that suggested European origins. What nobody realized was that Sophia's eyes had been tracking far more than the pages of her book. Every 30 minutes, she had glanced at her watch, not from impatience, but from habit. She had noted the flight attendants' locations during their service routines, observed the behavior of nervous flyers, and unconsciously cataloged the aircraft's sounds and movements. These weren't the observations of an anxious passenger, but the automatic threat assessment patterns of someone trained to notice everything. The book in her hands, a collection of poetry by Eugenio Montale, was dog-eared and heavily annotated, suggesting it had been read many times. But between the romantic verses were subtle notes, written in 3 different languages, coded reminders that would mean nothing to a casual observer, but everything to someone who understood operational security protocols. As Flight 624 began its descent, air traffic control at Paris Charles de Gaulle was coordinating the morning rush of incoming international flights. The controllers were experienced professionals managing the complex dance of aircraft approaching one of the world's busiest airports. Everything was proceeding normally until Charles de Gaulle Control received an unusual transmission from Italian Air Force Command. 2 Eurofighter Typhoon jets had been scrambled on what was initially described as a routine training exercise. The Typhoons, part of a joint NATO training program, were conducting intercept drills with commercial aircraft, a standard procedure designed to test response times and communication protocols. Flight 624 had been selected as the practice target, a common occurrence that most passengers never even noticed. The lead Typhoon pilot, Squadron Leader Marco Ferrari, was a decorated Italian Air Force officer with over 2,500 hours in fighter aircraft. His wingman, Lieutenant Colonel Elena Torres, was one of the youngest pilots ever qualified to fly the Eurofighter. Both were elite aviators, the kind of pilots who lived and breathed military precision. As they approached Flight 624's position, Ferrari's radio crackled with routine communications from air traffic control. The exercise was proceeding normally, with the commercial aircraft maintaining course and altitude while the fighters performed their intercept protocols. It was supposed to be a textbook training mission, the kind that would be logged and forgotten by evening. But sometimes routine flights become anything but routine. Sometimes the most ordinary circumstances reveal the most extraordinary people. And sometimes passenger 127 becomes something much more significant than anyone could have imagined. In seat 19F, Sophia Rossi closed her book and looked out the window at the French countryside spreading below. She checked her watch one more time, noting their position and altitude with the precision of someone who understood exactly where they were and where they needed to be. She had no idea that in approximately 12 minutes, everything would change. Sophia Rossi had learned long ago that being underestimated was often an advantage. At 5 feet 4 inches tall, with a slight build and quiet demeanor, she possessed the rare gift of invisibility in crowds. Throughout her life, people had looked at her and seen exactly what they expected to see, a young woman who appeared unremarkable in every conventional sense. Her fellow passengers on Flight 624 saw her as they saw dozens of other travelers, forgettable. The businessman in 19, he had glanced at her once when settling into his seat, dismissing her as probably a student or perhaps a young professional on vacation. The elderly couple in 19D and 19G had offered polite smiles when she had helped the woman stow her carry-on bag, noting her helpfulness but thinking nothing more of it. Even the flight crew treated her as part of the background. Flight attendant Jean-Luc Webb had served her coffee with professional courtesy, but his attention was focused on the more demanding passengers. The executive who requested 3 different newspapers, the mother struggling with twin toddlers in row 16, the man in first class who complained about the temperature twice. What none of them could see was the person beneath the unremarkable exterior. Sophia's quiet confidence wasn't shyness. It was the controlled awareness of someone trained to observe rather than be observed. Her steady hands weren't just calm. They were hands that had operated complex systems under extreme pressure. Her alert eyes weren't merely intelligent. They were eyes that had seen combat and learned to read situations others couldn't comprehend. Born in Naples to an Italian mother and American father, Sophia had grown up bilingual and bicultural, moving between worlds with an adaptability that would later prove invaluable. Her childhood had been unremarkable by most standards. Good grades, a few close friends, a love of aviation sparked by visits to her grandfather, a retired Alitalia pilot who had filled her head with stories of flight. At 18, she surprised everyone by enrolling in the Italian Air Force Academy. Her family had expected her to pursue journalism or international relations, fields that seemed to match her linguistic abilities and quiet intelligence. Instead, she had chosen a path that would transform her from an unassuming young woman into one of the most skilled combat pilots in NATO. The Italian Air Force had initially shared her family's doubts. Flight training was demanding both physically and mentally, with a dropout rate that eliminated most candidates before they ever reached advanced aircraft. Sophia's instructors had looked at her during those first weeks and wondered if she had the presence, the commanding personality they associated with military aviation. They'd been wrong about almost everything. While her classmates relied on aggression and bravado, Sophia succeeded through precision and intelligence. She had outflown candidates who were taller, stronger, and louder, earning her wings through sheer skill and determination. Her flight instructors had noted that she possessed an almost supernatural awareness of aircraft systems, weather conditions, and tactical situations. But it was her performance during a training emergency that first earned her real respect. When mechanical failure had put her aircraft and her instructor at risk, Sophia had executed a perfect emergency landing under conditions that had grounded more experienced pilots. Her debrief had been a masterclass in crisis management, delivered in the same quiet voice that had once made her instructors doubt her potential. After earning her commission, Sophia had been selected for NATO's elite exchange program, flying missions across Europe and the Mediterranean. She had piloted everything from transport aircraft to fighter jets, accumulating flight hours and commendations that would have made pilots twice her age envious. Her call sign Falcon had been earned during a classified operation where she had successfully completed a mission after her aircraft had been severely damaged. Yet despite her achievements, Sophia had never lost the ability to blend into civilian environments. Military colleagues who had seen her in combat situations often failed to recognize her in regular clothes. It was a skill she had cultivated deliberately, understanding that sometimes the most effective operators were those who could disappear into the background when necessary. Now at 26, she was on leave from active duty, taking what she had described to her family as a sabbatical to decide her future. The truth was more complex. Recent missions had left her questioning aspects of military life, and she was considering transitioning to civilian aviation, perhaps following her grandfather's footsteps into commercial flying. This flight to Paris was part of that exploration. She had meetings scheduled with several European airlines, interviews that might determine whether her future lay in military service or civilian aviation. It was a crossroads moment, the kind she had approached with her characteristic methodical planning. What she hadn't planned for was the possibility that her two worlds, military and civilian, would collide at 35,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean. As Flight 624 continued its descent toward Paris, Sophia remained just another passenger, her extraordinary background hidden beneath layers of intentional ordinariness. In 12 minutes, that would change forever. Throughout her civilian transition, Sophia had grown accustomed to a different kind of dismissal than what she had faced in military training. In the Air Force, doubts about her capabilities had been direct and measurable. Could she handle the forces? Could she master complex aircraft systems? Could she make split-second tactical decisions under fire? Once she had proven herself, respect had followed, even if grudgingly. But in civilian aviation, the exclusion was more subtle and somehow more frustrating. During her preliminary interviews with European airlines over the past month, she had encountered a pattern of polite interest followed by gentle redirection. Her military credentials were impressive, the recruiters acknowledged, but perhaps she might consider starting in a training role. Or maybe regional flights would be a better fit for someone transitioning from military service. The subtext was always the same. She looked too young, too small, too soft for the commanding presence they associated with commercial aviation captains. Never mind that she had logged over 3,000 flight hours in aircraft far more complex than any civilian jetliner. Never mind that she had successfully completed missions in weather conditions that would ground commercial flights for days. At Lufthansa's Munich headquarters, the chief pilot had spent most of their meeting explaining how different civilian flying was from military operations. "It's about passenger confidence," he had said, leaning back in his leather chair. "People want to see someone who looks like they can handle any situation." His eyes had lingered on her small frame as he spoke, making his meaning clear without saying it directly. Air France had been more diplomatic but equally dismissive. The interview had gone well until the final panel, where she had been asked about her long-term career goals in a tone that suggested they were already planning to offer her a position she wouldn't want. When she had mentioned her interest in flying wide-body aircraft on international routes, the silence had stretched uncomfortably long. "Perhaps we should start you on our domestic routes," the senior captain had finally suggested. "You could gain valuable experience with passenger service while you adapt to civilian procedures." He had smiled as he said it, the kind of smile that was meant to soften what felt like a demotion from someone who had piloted fighter jets over hostile territory. What made the rejections particularly stinging was the knowledge that she was significantly more qualified than many pilots being hired by the same airlines. Through her network of military contacts who had transitioned successfully to civilian aviation, she had learned about recent hires at various carriers. Pilots with fewer flight hours, less diverse aircraft experience, and limited emergency training were being offered positions she was being denied. The flight to Paris was supposed to be part of changing that pattern. She had a final interview scheduled with Air France headquarters the following morning, one last chance to prove herself in European commercial aviation. But the rejection from Lufthansa had crystallized something that had been building for months. She was tired of proving herself to people who weren't qualified to evaluate her capabilities. As Flight 624 continued its descent toward Charles de Gaulle, Sophia reflected on the interview she had scheduled for the following morning. Another airline, another panel of recruiters who would probably offer her another position that fell short of her qualifications and experience. She had begun to wonder if civilian aviation was ready for someone like her, or she should return to military service where her capabilities were understood and valued. She had no way of knowing that in 8 minutes, the question of her suitability for civilian aviation leadership would be answered definitively in front of witnesses who would never again doubt what someone her size could accomplish at the controls of an aircraft in crisis. At 11:47 a.m. local time, Flight 624 was 23 minutes from its scheduled arrival at Paris Charles de Gaulle when Captain Du Bois keyed his microphone to begin the standard pre-landing announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, from the flight deck, we're beginning our initial descent into Paris Charles de Gaulle. Weather conditions are excellent with clear skies and light winds. We should have you on the ground, right on schedule. The announcement was routine, delivered in the calm, professional tone that passengers expected from airline captains. Du Bois had made similar announcements thousands of times during his career, and this morning felt no different from countless other transatlantic crossings. The Airbus A350 was performing perfectly, all systems were nominal, and the approach into Charles de Gaulle was proceeding exactly as planned. In the galley, senior flight attendant Jean-Luc Webb was preparing the cabin for landing, working through the familiar checklist of securing service equipment and ensuring passenger compliance with safety regulations. The flight had been remarkably smooth. No turbulence, no medical emergencies, no difficult passengers. It was the kind of routine flight that crew members appreciated but rarely remembered afterward. First Officer Martin was updating the flight management system with current weather data from Charles de Gaulle when she noticed the first anomaly, a subtle change in engine noise that lasted barely 2 seconds before returning to normal. She glanced at the engine parameters on her display, but all readings appeared normal. Still, her training had taught her to investigate anything unusual, no matter how minor it seemed. "Michel, did you hear that engine noise change about 30 seconds ago?" she asked Captain Du Bois, using his first name in the informal communication style common among experienced crews. Du Bois nodded, having noticed the same thing. "I caught that too. All parameters look good though. Probably just a momentary fluctuation in fuel flow." He performed a quick visual scan of the engine instruments, confirming that temperatures, pressures, and RPM readings were all within normal ranges. What neither pilot realized was that the momentary engine irregularity was the first symptom of a catastrophic failure that was developing deep within the aircraft's number 2 engine. A microscopic crack in a turbine blade, undetectable during routine inspections, had been growing gradually over hundreds of flight hours. The stress of sustained cruise operation had finally expanded the crack to a critical size, and fracture was imminent. The turbine blade separation happened in milliseconds, but its effects cascaded through multiple aircraft systems with devastating speed. The failed blade struck adjacent blades, creating a catastrophic unbalance that sent violent vibrations throughout the engine structure. Within seconds, the entire engine began tearing itself apart from the inside. The first indication in the cockpit was a violent shudder that seemed to shake the entire aircraft. Then came a series of warning lights and alarms that turned the quiet flight deck into chaos. Master caution lights illuminated, engine fire warnings activated, and the aircraft systems began reporting a cascade of failures. "Engine fire number 2, Martin called out, her voice sharp with adrenaline as she read the emergency displays. But before Du Bois could respond, the situation became much worse. The engine separation was so violent that it severed critical hydraulic lines and electrical systems. The Airbus A350's redundant safety systems were designed to handle single-point failures, but the catastrophic nature of this engine failure was damaging multiple systems simultaneously. Within 30 seconds, the aircraft had lost primary flight controls, backup hydraulic power, and several crucial avionics systems. Du Bois fought the controls as the aircraft began an uncommanded roll to the right. The fly-by-wire system that normally made the A350 stable and predictable was failing, leaving the pilots with limited manual control over a machine that suddenly wanted to tear itself apart in the sky. Mayday, mayday, mayday. Du Bois transmitted on the emergency frequency, his voice professional despite the crisis. Air France 624, we have multiple engine failure and system malfunctions. Requesting immediate vectors to nearest suitable airport and emergency services standing by. The response from Paris Control was immediate but couldn't address the fundamental problem. Flight 624 was 23 minutes from Charles de Gaulle with 298 souls on board, and the aircraft was rapidly becoming unflyable. In the passenger cabin, the violent shaking and sudden altitude changes had triggered panic. Oxygen masks dropped from the overhead compartments as the aircraft's damaged systems responded to what they interpreted as a rapid decompression event. Passengers screamed as luggage fell from overhead bins, and the aircraft pitched and rolled in ways that passenger jets were never supposed to move. Most of the passengers were terrified but helpless, strapping themselves into their seats and following the flight attendants' shouted instructions to prepare for emergency procedures. But in seat 19F, Sophia Rossi was making calculations that had nothing to do with passenger safety briefings. Her trained ear had recognized the specific sound signature of the engine failure. Not just mechanical damage, but the kind of catastrophic separation that could compromise multiple aircraft systems. Her eyes tracked the aircraft's unusual movements, identifying control responses that suggested hydraulic failure and possible flight control system damage. While other passengers prayed or panicked, Sophia was mentally reviewing emergency procedures for exactly this type of failure scenario. She had studied them not as theoretical exercises, but as practical problems she might someday need to solve. That study was about to become critically relevant, because in the cockpit, Captain Du Bois and First Officer Martin were discovering that their aircraft was beyond the scope of standard emergency procedures. "Claire, I can't control the pitch," Du Bois said through gritted teeth, fighting to keep the aircraft level as it wanted to nose down into an increasingly steep descent. "The elevators aren't responding properly, and we're losing hydraulic pressure in all three systems." Martin was working frantically through emergency checklists, but the combination of failures they were facing wasn't covered by any single procedure. Multiple systems were failing faster than they could respond to individual problems, and the aircraft was becoming increasingly unstable with each passing second. In 2 minutes, they would make a decision that would change everything. But first, they had to acknowledge something that no airline captain ever wants to admit. They were in a situation beyond their training, experience, and available resources to handle. Flight 624 was going down, and everyone on board was about to discover what passenger 127 could do when the impossible became the only option for survival. Sophia didn't wait for permission from Jean-Luc Webb. As the aircraft shuddered through another violent pitch change, she moved past the flight attendant with the fluid confidence of someone accustomed to navigating unstable platforms under extreme conditions. Webb, still processing her claim of being a military pilot, found himself following rather than stopping her. The cockpit door was locked according to Post 9/11 security protocols, but Webb's master key opened it to reveal Captain Du Bois and First Officer Martin in the middle of what appeared to be a losing battle with their aircraft. Both pilots were focused entirely on their instruments and controls, sweat visible on their faces despite the cool cabin temperature. "Captain Du Bois," Sophia announced herself, her voice cutting through the cacophony of alarms and radio chatter. "I'm Major Sophia Rossi, Italian Air Force. I have extensive experience with multi-system aircraft failures, and I believe I can assist with your current emergency." Du Bois's initial reaction was disbelief mixed with irritation. He was dealing with the most serious emergency of his career, and the last thing he needed was a passenger claiming she could help. But something in her tone, the calm authority and precise terminology, made him glance away from his instruments for a split second. Ma'am, I appreciate the offer, but this is not the time for. Captain, you're dealing with catastrophic hydraulic failure combined with flight control system damage. Sophia interrupted, her voice remaining steady as she assessed the cockpit displays over his shoulder. Your primary concern right now is preventing the aircraft from entering an unrecoverable dive while maintaining enough airspeed to reach a suitable landing site. Martin looked up from her emergency checklist, surprised by the technical accuracy of the passenger's assessment. How do you know our system status? Because I've been monitoring your radio communications, and I can read your instrument displays, Sophia replied matter-of-factly. More importantly, I've trained extensively for exactly this type of emergency. You're attempting to use standard Airbus emergency procedures, but this failure combination requires manual flight techniques that aren't covered in civilian training programs. Du Bois was about to dismiss her again when the aircraft pitched into an even steeper dive, forcing him to use both hands and significant physical strength just to prevent a complete loss of control. The standard recovery techniques weren't working, and his options were rapidly diminishing. What manual flight techniques? Martin asked, desperation creeping into her professional composure. Sophia moved closer to the center console, her eyes scanning the flight instruments with the practiced efficiency of someone who could read aircraft systems as easily as most people read books. You're fighting the aircraft instead of working with it. In a situation like this, you need to use differential thrust combined with rudder inputs to maintain directional control while using elevator trim to manage pitch attitude instead of trying to force the controls. Differential thrust? Du Bois questioned, even as part of his mind recognized the logic of what she was suggesting. Your remaining engine can provide both forward thrust and directional control if you modulate the power correctly, Sophia explained, her hands moving to indicate the throttle controls without actually touching them. Combined with careful rudder inputs, you can essentially fly the aircraft like a large fighter jet with compromised controls. I've done it before, just not in a civilian aircraft this size. Outside the cockpit windows, the French countryside was becoming visibly larger as Flight 624 continued its descent through 18,000 feet. Time was running out for theoretical discussions, and Du Bois realized that his conventional training had reached its limits. You actually recovered from this type of failure? He asked, his desperation finally overcoming his skepticism. Multiple times in various aircraft types, Sophia confirmed. The principles are the same regardless of the aircraft size. You're trying to use flight controls that aren't responding properly. Instead, you need to use the systems that are still functional. Engine power, rudder authority, and trim controls to maintain aircraft attitude and heading. Martin was studying her emergency displays with new understanding. The trim system is still partially responsive. We hadn't tried using it as a primary flight control because civilian emergency procedures assume you'll maintain primary flight control authority. Exactly, Sophia said. Military procedures assume you won't, because combat damage often eliminates multiple systems simultaneously. You need to treat this as a combat damage scenario, not a standard commercial aviation emergency. The radio crackled with another transmission from Paris Control. Air France 624, be advised you are now through flight level 150 and descending rapidly. What is your current control status? Du Bois looked at Sophia, his expression shifting from skepticism to desperate hope. Can you actually help us regain control of this aircraft? I can try, she replied, her confidence evident but not overconfident. But I'll need access to the controls, and you'll need to trust techniques that aren't in your standard operating procedures. Du Bois and Martin exchanged glances, two experienced pilots facing a decision that went against everything they had been trained about cockpit resource management and chain of command. But their aircraft was dying around them, and conventional solutions had already failed. What do you need? Du Bois asked. Sophia moved to the left side of the cockpit, positioning herself where she could reach the throttle controls and trim system. I need you to maintain rudder pressure while I work the power settings. Martin, I need you to call out altitude and airspeed while monitoring system status. We're going to attempt a power-on approach using differential thrust for primary directional control. As she placed her hands on the controls, Sophia felt the familiar sensation of an aircraft in distress. The subtle vibrations and erratic responses that indicated damaged systems and compromised flight characteristics. But she also felt something else, the potential for recovery that Du Bois and Martin hadn't been able to detect. The Airbus A350 was badly damaged, but it wasn't completely uncontrollable. It just required techniques that civilian pilots were never taught, methods developed through military experience with aircraft that had been shot up, damaged, or pushed beyond their design limitations. "Ready?" she asked, her voice calm despite the fact that she was about to attempt a recovery technique that had never been tried on a civilian airliner of this size. Du Bois and Martin nodded, their skepticism replaced by desperate hope of professionals who understood they were out of conventional options. Outside, the Eurofighter Typhoons were approaching Flight 624's position, their pilots having no idea that the most critical part of the emergency was just beginning, and that Passenger 127 was about to prove that extraordinary expertise could emerge from the most unlikely circumstances when survival demanded the impossible.